Okay, welcome everyone. As I said, my name is Kristy Morley and I am the senior naturalist here at Wissahickon Trails. Just a few housekeeping items. If this is your first time joining us, you should have come into the call with your microphones muted, and I'm going to ask everyone to keep their microphones muted throughout the call, just so that we don't get too much feedback. There are a lot of people on the call. So if you could do that, that would be great. If you're having trouble seeing things playing, seeing video of me, oftentimes if you turn off your own video camera, you will get a stronger internet connection, and that may sort of solve your issues. If for some reason you have to drop off, you can easily log back on. You shouldn't have a problem. Please feel free to use the chat box for questions. If you're on a computer, usually it's at either the very top or the very bottom of your screen. There's usually a scroll bar that you can roll over and see that chat box. I will stop several times throughout the program tonight to take a look at that box and see what questions folks have. And just a reminder that the recording will be available online, usually within a week. Usually it's the next day, but sometimes we get a little behind. So usually within a week, if there's something that you want to go back and check, or for some reason you have to drop off early, there will be a recording available. So the dance of the Timberdoodle. For those who are not aware, Timberdoodle is another name for an American woodcock, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through this evening. So for those who are new to our organization, if you've not joined us for a call previously, welcome. If this is your first time, we are an environmental nonprofit based in Ambler, Pennsylvania, founded a little over 60 years ago to protect the land and the water of the Wissahickon Creek. We operate in Montgomery County with our partners in Philadelphia, who protect the creek as it enters Philadelphia on its way to the Schuylkill River. We, as Wissahickon Trails, have protected nearly 1,300 acres of land from development in Montgomery County. And on that land, we have 12 nature preserves and 24 miles of trails that are open for your enjoyment. If you are a supporter of ours, thank you from the bottom of my heart. We couldn't do this work without you. And if you're not currently a supporter of our organization, I encourage you to go take a look at our website. There's a lot more detail of the work that we have going on, the projects that we have in the area. You can check out our interactive map and see information about all the preserves and where to park and what kind of trail there is and how difficult it might be. And all of that information is on our website, as well as ways to become a supporter of ours. And we do really count on our supporters to help continue our mission. Since we are a nonprofit, we couldn't do this without your support. So again, if you are a current supporter, I thank you. And if you're not currently, check us out and maybe give us your support so we can continue to do our work. So tonight, just real quick, a little plan for the evening. We are going to talk sort of three broad areas about woodcocks or timberdoodles, as the case may be. The natural history, sort of understanding a little bit about them as a species. We're going to talk specifically about the breeding male aerial display, which is often referred to as a dance. Most of it happens in the air, thus aerial display, but still often referred to as a dance. So that's where the dance of the Timberdoodle comes from. We're going to talk really quickly at the end about our Woodcock Citizen Science project that we have going on. So if this is something that interests you and you want to help participate, help us track how these birds are using our properties, you'll learn a little bit about that. And then at the very end, if you can hang on till the very end of the program, I do have a special announcement that I will share with you that's not going to be on the recording. So you have to stay on the call for that part if you want to hear it. So real quickly, the American woodcock. This is a woodcock that you see on your screen. It has a whole lot of different names depending on when in history you are, where you are in parts of the country. It goes by the name the forest-dwelling shorebird, the timberdoodle, the bogsucker, the night partridge, big eyes, which you can kind of see there, mudbat, and Labrador twister. That one comes from Canada. So variety of names. Its true name is the American woodcock. And all of these names really come from the habitats that it lives in and the sounds it makes for the most part. So you will get an idea of sort of how all of these names came to be as we go through this presentation. You'll start to see how some of them apply to this bird. So from a bird identification point of view, the woodcock is pretty unique. There's not much else that looks like it, but it is part of a group of birds that are often lumped together as shorebirds. And to most birders, this group of birds includes things such as sandpipers, avocets, stilts, plovers, oyster catchers. These birds are actually quite varied. All of the birds that you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, they're all shorebirds as well. And you can see there's quite some variety there. There are some species of shorebirds, usually these little small ones here in this long picture in the middle, that tend to give birders a hard time, and they look a lot alike. And they can be really confusing sometimes, especially to beginning birders. Thankfully, the woodcock clearly is not one of those birds. It's pretty unique in what it looks like. Even among the shorebirds, it's pretty unique and stands out fairly easily. The only bird in our part of the country that we have that sort of even remotely looks like it is the Wilson snipe. And that's this picture I just put up here on the bottom. This is also a shorebird. These two birds are more closely related than the other shorebirds that we see here. And you can see they kind of have this similar body shape, this short, pudgy, kind of really deep chested, big bellied, short legged, long billed kind of look. But other than that, they're very different. One easy way to know the difference is the snipe, which my cursor's on now down here at the bottom, has stripes on its head that go along its head, across its face like this, where the woodcock, you can see here on the right, has sort of lines that go across the top of its head, not down its head towards its back. Their color's a little bit different. Snipe don't have this buffy color on their belly like the woodcocks do. And the biggest one is that they have very different habitats. So snipe you would expect to find in a marsh, on a tidal mudflat, a swamp, maybe at the edge of a swamp. It would be very rare to find woodcocks in a lot of those places. Given its name, it might be a clue. The best place to actually find woodcocks is in the woods, not on the shore like we would think of most other typical shorebirds. That's just a quick introduction to sort of what it looks like and sort of where it fits in the greater family of birds that it's related to. Let me talk really quickly about its range. This is just from a typical field guide, looking at the woodcocks, and this bright yellow is the spring summer rains. And so you can see here, right here in our corner of Pennsylvania, it's pretty much only here in the spring on migration and during the summer for breeding. Year round though, places in South Jersey and into Delaware, they're actually here all year round, and it is possible to see them all year round. For us, it's mostly on spring migration, although they might be breeding here. And that's one of the things that our community science project is looking at to understand if we do actually have breeding birds on our preserve. So this is just a map of Pennsylvania from the Pennsylvania Breeding Bird Atlas. This data was collected in 2004, 2009. This was the last time that this atlas was actually done in Pennsylvania. It's really due for a new one, but I don't think they've started this project yet. But you can see in Montgomery County, the biggest circles that you can see are confirmed breeding sites, and then the next smallest ones that are all around that are possible breeding sites. And there's a few at the edges of the county and right in the tip of Philadelphia County that are possible breeding sites. They weren't actually able to confirm. So you can see it does actually breed right in our area. It breeds widely across the state of Pennsylvania, but there are some birds right in our area, relatively speaking, that do breed here. And that is one thing that we are trying to confirm on the properties that we're managing. So you can learn more about that in a second. One really interesting thing about woodcock is that they have what's called a prehensile bill. And this just basically is a fancy way of saying that their bill is flexible. This top portion of their bill right here is flexible. And the reason why is because their biggest source of food, like 3/4 of their diet, is earthworms. And so if you can imagine trying to get a worm, they will pull them out kind of like if you've ever seen a robin pulling a worm out, it'll stick its beak in and it'll fight with the worm to pull it out. Woodcock have the advantage that they can stick almost their entire bill all the way into the ground, and that flexible tip actually allows them to open their bill under the ground. Unlike most other birds that might only be able to open it just a smidgen, they can actually open it fairly widely and be able to grab an earthworm. And you can actually also see the little serrations on the inside of their bill that help them grab onto those slippery worms while they're underground and pull them out. They will also eat a variety of other invertebrates, but earthworms is pretty much the biggest part of their diet. And their bills in total are about 2.5 inches long. So they're a pretty big bill that they're sticking all the way down into the ground. And I have a video here of a woodcock eating, feeding, searching for food. And one of the things that you'll notice is you'll see this characteristic bob up and down that they do. Let me play the video for you, and then we'll talk a little bit about what that actually is doing. Yeah, that bob up and down. So you can see that bob. The best explanation for this bob is that by doing this, the vibrations that the bird makes help make the earthworms move, so it makes it easier for the bird to find them. And that's a pretty good explanation if the only time they did it was when they were feeding. You can go search on YouTube and for woodcock walking, strutting, crossing the road, whatever you want to attach to that. And you will see a ton of videos of woodcocks actually walking across a paved road or a paved sidewalk, doing that up and down bob, just like that. And there's clearly no earthworms that they're going to get out of the pavement. It may just be the way they function. And it's possible that they don't really know the difference between, you know, a paved surface and the woods. Obviously, they're not going to try to eat in pavement, but they walk that way anyway. And so it's actually pretty hysterical to see them walking like that, you know, as they are moving. But that characteristic bob is just something that they do. So I'm going to rewind this a little bit. And you did see that the bird actually found a worm. I don't know why it's not eating that worm. My best guess is that worm actually kind of looks like it's dead, and the bird decided that that was not a good meal to have. But you see that up and down sort of bob, and as it walks forward, you can really notice it. So when I name this program the Dance of the Timberdoodle, it's for two reasons. One is that's almost a dance. And when you look, if you choose to look at it on YouTube, you'll notice that a lot of people set it to very funny dance music as well when the bird's crossing the road. But that's not the main dance that I wanted to talk about tonight. And we'll get into the male aerial display in a bit. But woodcock almost have two dances because they have this one that they do when they're trying to find earthworms, as well as the breeding display. So when we talk about habitats, as I said, the woods are really important for woodcock. And within a forest, they need really wet, not wet, but damp rich, moist soils that are going to support a lot of earthworms. If there's not a lot of earthworms in an area, even if everything else is good, they won't stay there because that is the major source of their food. And they need, if you look at this sort of graph here on the right, or the left, they need a variety of different kinds of habitats for different things. So they need open areas and fields for their singing grounds, which we'll talk about the male singing in a minute, or roosting. They will sometimes roost in these open areas during the day, males and females as well. For feeding, both males and females need sort of young to medium age forest habitats that have some wet areas, keeps the soil moist, not too compacted. For nesting and rearing the babies, the females need both the very young and the medium young forest, but they'll also venture into forests that are a little bit older. And the picture that I have here on the right of the inside of the woods, this is actually our Crossways Preserve. And this is probably in this 15 to 30 year range forest. A lot of this land was farmland before, and so it was clear cut, and then trees have regrown since it hasn't been farmed in a long while. So this is probably, most of these trees are in the 15 to 30 years. Some of them might be a little bit older than that. But you can see this green, really dark green area in the middle. This is actually a really wet spot in the woods, which is why that sort of different kind of grass is growing there. And the land around this actually tends to be really wet as well in this area. And you can see as you get towards the edge, especially over here, there's a little bit of lower growth, sort of this younger 2 to 3 years, 10 years, sort of shrubs on the edge. And if you look straight through back, this is actually a house on the backside, and there's a fence here. There's actually a cut along the edge of the woods before you get to that fence. This is a horse farm, and that cut is one of those open areas that they might use. They might even go all the way out into the field, the horse pasture, to do their breeding aerial flight display. But that open area is really important. And this is another example of that here. This is actually the trail, the human trail at Crossways. But on either side of that trail are these large grassy areas. Now, this is a little bit later in the season, so the grasses are very tall. But at this time of the year, our conservation team has either mowed them already, because we usually mow in the very early spring. And if they haven't been mowed quite yet, they're very mashed down from the winter weather, from rain and snow. And so they will sort of get mulched up when they do mow. And that open area against the edge of the woods here in the back is a very important spot for the woodcock, for their singing and for their breeding display. So that combination of open areas and woods is really important. For their roosting during the day, they tend to like more open areas. So they would actually, in theory, be more likely to roost on this path where they could see predators coming for them than they would be to like roost in the tall grass, for example. They would tend to roost a little bit more out in the open so that they can see what's going on. And those eyes on the top of their head actually help them when they're looking down feeding so that they can see predators coming and be aware of their surroundings, even though their bill is all the way down into the ground. So from a nesting and young perspective, nests are really simple. They're on the ground, sort of a hollowed out cup, maybe sort of lined with some leaves, usually around 4 eggs. Only the female bird incubates the eggs. The males have nothing to do with taking care of the young. The eggs can be laid as early as April 1st. And if that's the case, they'll hatch by the end of April. So it's about a month that they'll be an egg. Excuse me. The young are adorable. Like a lot of shorebirds, the young are born ready to go. They're like, we think of chickens. Chickens come out of the egg and they dry off and they're ready to run. And that's what happens with a lot of shorebirds. their time in the nest is very, very limited. You can see from the picture on the left, there's not much of a nest. So that's not really much protection for the bird. And so in this case, the birds stay in that sort of nest area, maybe just for a couple of hours after they hatch, maybe overnight, depending on when they hatch during the day. Once they're dry, they're running around and following mom. And that's really important to their safety, because there's just not a lot of protection for them being on the ground and, not really in a nest, so to speak, like we think of birds' nests. They're fed by their mom for about a week, but they will actually start probing for food on their own when they're about 3 or 4 days old. So they watch mom. A lot of it's probably instinctive, but they learn that really quickly and start doing that. And by the time they're about a month old, they're kind of living independently. They'll follow mom around for that short period of time, maybe about a month. They will freeze if mom warns them. Predators are around, they'll freeze. They will sometimes scurry back to her for protection under her wings. But by and large, they're running around the woods, ready to go. So as you can imagine, and you've kind of already seen this, these are cryptic birds in their proper habitat, and they can be very difficult to see. So you see from the picture on the left, their coloring really allows them to blend in with all the leaves on the forest floor. They're really designed to do that. The picture on the right is actually of a nesting bird, and you can see if you didn't, you're all looking at this really carefully, but if you were out in the woods, there's a really good chance you wouldn't even see her sitting there because she's very quiet. She's not making alarm calls, not drawing any attention to herself, and there's a really good chance that you could just walk right past her and not even realize that she's there. And these birds are notorious for doing that. They're difficult to see, number one, and they have this habit of sitting still until you are literally right on top of them. Like your next step would come down on top of their back. That's when they decide to fly. So oftentimes, if you're on a trail that might have woodcock on it, the only view that you get of them is this small brown bird explosively flying away from you as fast as it possibly can, low to the ground. And that is the typical view that a lot of people have of woodcock. And it's not a very good one, obviously. The best time to see them and often really hear them is the male's display flight. And we're going to dive into that in a little bit. I'm going to stop here and see if there's any questions, and then we'll dive into the male's flight. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat box. And I'm not seeing any there now. That's fine. Like I said, feel free to drop them in at any time. And I will stop again when we get to the end of this section. Oh, I saw one pop up. Territorial. So the question is, are they territorial? And not really. The males will often display, multiple males will display in the same area. They're all trying to attract a female, and the females will kind of have their own sort of area, but they're not really territorial the way we think of birds being territorial. And there's usually not so many of them in a given area that they really have to worry about it. Okay, do they have a distinctive kind of call is the first question, which we're going to talk about in a minute, because really it's only the males doing their breeding call that really kind of have a distinctive call. Is the range expanding due to the invasive earthworms, or do they only eat native worms? That's a really good question. I think they eat all of the worms. I don't think they eat only native worms. I'm not entirely positive about that, but it doesn't seem so far like their ranges are expanding. But for most birds, range expansion happens over a period of time. And it's kind of usually a slow process. So I don't really think we've seen that significantly with these birds. But again, there's probably a lot more of them out there than we realize, but they're not a particularly common bird for most of us to see or even hear. So I think part of it is because there's not as many of them, it's harder to see that range expansion because they're really, if it's happening, because they're really difficult to see in the field and observe in most cases. Oh, the question is there any coloration difference between males and females? Nope, they look exactly the same. So unless you are viewing a male doing its territorial display for the breeding season, you wouldn't be able to tell. Or you saw a bird with chicks, that's a female because the males don't do any of the parental care. So yeah, other than that, that's the only way to tell the difference. All right, one more. I'm going to get into the community science. The question is about, I mentioned the community science project and how does one get involved in that? And I'm going to talk about that in the last section of tonight's program. Some more details about that. So I'm going to jump on to the male aerial display or the dance. The dance sounds better than the male aerial display, but it's basically means the same thing for our purposes here tonight. So the male, this display is literally used to attract a female for mating. That's it. One male may actually mate with several females, and the male, as I said, plays no role in the nest site selection, incubating, or raising the young. Once they mate, they move on. They either continue further north and look for more mates, or they may start flying south early if they're done breeding, since they don't have to worry about raising the young. For us in our area, we can generally start hearing them. February to April is typically when they're most active. And usually I tend to think of March as being the most active month, but when really early springs happen, you can hear them as early as February, and they can linger into April depending. This display and the sounds that go with it are usually given twice a day, once at dawn and once at dusk, weather permitting. They like calm. It doesn't have to necessarily be clear. They don't mind clouds. And in fact, clouds, because clouds darken the sky earlier, they tend to start singing earlier when it's cloudy. But they won't sing, rarely will they sing in the rain. They won't sing in the wind because of the flight that they have to do with this song. And they like the temperatures to be above freezing. They're not as active when the temperatures are below freezing, particularly for doing this display. And each display that a male does has two parts to it. One called the peent and one is the flight. And we're going to break those two down to understand what they're doing during each part of that. And then at the end, we'll be able to hear the whole flight together, the peent and the flight part. I have video of the peent. I don't have video of the flight. It's not my video. I'm going to say that right now. I wish it was my video. The flight is really hard to video, so we only have sound for that. So I'm going to play both of them a couple times so that you have an opportunity to hear them because they are difficult. So they start with the peent, and the peent is done on the ground. It is done, usually the bird turns in a circle and peents in all four directions. So before they launch themselves into the air, most of the times when a bird starts, they will do 4 or 5 peenting sounds before they take off. So I'm going to play this video. I think, there we go. And there he goes for the rest of the flight. So you can see that he turns in a circle, and I'm sorry, he gives like 4 or 5 peents in each direction, not 4 or 5 peents total. But that idea of turning in a circle is trying to make sure that any female that's around him can hear him. And often when you're trying to listen for these birds and you're out in the field, you can actually hear the direction that he turns in, because in the direction that the bird is facing you or closest facing you, it sounds really loud, and then it'll start to get a little quieter when it turns. And then when it turns so that it's facing away from you, the peent sounds really quiet, and then it comes back around sounding pretty loud. And so you can actually tell that the bird is turning around when you hear it in the field. And so it'll do this, turn in its circle, and make sure that everybody knows it's there, and then it will launch itself into the air. And so for the flight part of its display, it's actually rather complicated. And it starts down here on the ground, and when the bird is finished its painting, and it starts flying up, but it flies in these sort of tight spirals up into the air. And then as it gets higher and higher, so it launches itself upward. When it launches itself upward, and you might have heard this at the end of the video, and I can go back really quick, you hear what are called wing twitters. And I'll explain that in a minute. As the spirals get larger and larger, as the bird gets higher and higher, you continue to hear wing twitters. The bird makes wing twitter sounds as it's going up. At the top of the flight, it can reach as high as 300 feet in the air. It will do several large circles around the top, very wide circles. It's often very difficult to hear at that point, but it will start, in addition to the wing twitters, which it still does, it will start adding vocal chirps. And then as it starts descending, it falls back in a zigzag pattern, as you can see here on the picture, and then it starts adding louder vocal chirps, and you'll see that. And I have a sound to play at the whole thing for you, which we're going to play a couple times so that you can make sure you hear it. But I want to go back to the video for a second. Oops. And if we play this, and let's get it down towards the end here, listen when it takes off. Hear that? It's hard to describe the sound. It almost sounds like a bird chittering. That's actually that bird's wings making that noise. It's not making that noise with its mouth. And those are the wing twitters. So if we go back through, yes, you get the wing twitters, larger and larger spirals, wing twitters and vocal chirps, and then vocal chirps on the way back down. What makes the sound are these specialized feathers at the end of the male bird's wings. And so if you had a bird in your hand, you could tell the difference, because the males have these feathers that are smaller on the 3 outer primary feathers. Primary flight feathers are smaller than everything else. And that allows them to move differently when the bird flies and makes that sound. The space between them helps make that sound as well. And that's a unique thing about these birds. So I'm going to play the complete flight song for you. And I have the picture here to remind us what's going on. This bird's going to start with peents, and I think it does about 5 peents before it launches itself into the air. There are going to be spring peepers, the little tiny frogs in here. They were in the video as well. That's another good clue to when the woodcocks are calling. If you can hear spring peepers out and about, there's a really good chance that the woodcock are potentially in an area and maybe displaying in the proper habitat, because they often tend to sing at the same time of the year. So let's play this. I'm just going to play it once through, and then we'll go back and talk through it as it's happening. And now it's back down on the ground. I'm going to pause this and I'm going to take it back to the beginning, and I'm going to sort of talk as it's happening so that you make sure that you all understand where it is sort of in its flight. So obviously we're on the ground. We're going to do the, I think it does 5 paints. Now it's in the air, and that's those feathers on the end of its wings as it's spiraling up. And it starts to get really quiet the higher it gets, and really hard to hear. And now it's probably at its highest peak, and it's added in some vocal sounds. And these are really the vocal sounds as it's coming down. And that's its wing sounds landing. And it's going to start painting again. And it will do that over and over and over several times a night. And usually it starts at dusk, so a little bit after actual sunset. There is a specific darkness of the sky that they like to have. And so that's why when it's a cloudy night, for example, they may start singing a little bit earlier because the sky is a little bit darker. If it's a really, really clear night, they may start singing a little bit later because it takes a little bit longer for that sky to get really dark enough for them. And they will do this display not all night long. I mean, it only goes on for a certain period after the sun goes down, maybe about an hour, depending on the night, depending on the birds. If there's a lot of males in one area, for example, they might sort of be in competition with each other and trying to sing for a little bit longer to attract more females. But for the most part, it doesn't go on for very long in an evening. And then they'll start up again before the sun comes up a lot of times. I have found that the evening song is actually usually more consistent than the morning song is. I actually lived someplace that I had these behind my house. And so for the most of the month of March, I would hear them very, very consistently right after the sun went down, but I very rarely heard them in the morning. So I often encourage people, if they're going to go listen for them, that evening is the best time to do it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But that kind of gives you an overall idea of what this song looks like. And it's hard to show it to you because, as you can imagine, they're doing this really in the dark, and it is really difficult to video them as they fly. So there's just not very consistent videos of it. It's really only the sound recordings that sort of let us know what's going on. So the community science project that I mentioned earlier, we have a variety of community science projects that go on through the watershed. And for any of these kinds of projects, if you're interested, not all of these are ongoing right now. Some of them we're still sort of getting started, but these are kinds of things that we want to be doing, like vernal pool monitoring and frog call surveys and things like that. Please feel free to send me an email, and I can tell you how to, get your information in to be involved in any of these projects. But one of them that we do for the birds is the woodcock call surveys. And what this is going out and listening for that display that you hear, listening for that male singing during ideally the breeding season. And we started doing this looking only for the breeding season, and we weren't having very much luck. When we thought about it, we realized that one of the reasons why we're trying to do this is understand, are woodcocks using our properties at any time of the year to make sure that we're managing those habitats so that they're appropriate for them? Do we have good open areas that they might be able to display from, particularly in areas where there's wet woods nearby where the females might be interested, also for the males to eat while they're here migrating? Do we have areas that we can increase sort of the smaller trees and shrubs at the edge of a woodland to provide more cover for the ground nesting part of their life cycle and provide that protection for the mother and the babies as they're trying to be raised and survive on their own? And so we realized that it was just as important to try to track for migrants as it was to track for breeding birds, and know that if we have migrants on our preserves versus breeding birds. We would love to confirm breeding birds, and we've got a couple of anecdotal sightings here and there by staff, mostly at our Crossways Preserve, that suggests that there may actually be breeding birds there. We just have never been able to confirm it. So what we're doing is looking at the 4 preserves that are listed here: Crossways, Almond Trout, Willow Lake, and Dodsworth Run. And basically it's a roughly a weekly excursion to one of the preserves. If you're interested in doing this, about 15 to 30 minutes. It kind of depends on when sunset is and how long you choose to listen for. You need to listen for at least 5 minutes, but you can stay there for a little longer if you think there's a chance the birds might come out a little later, for example. That's entirely up to you. And then it's just a data sheet that's, you know, where'd you go? What date was it? What was the temperature? What was the weather like? And you know, how long did you stay and listen, and how many birds did you hear? Because oftentimes you can tell that there's more than one bird in an area because there'll be one, say, painting on your left-hand side, and then you hear it take off, and then one on the right-hand side starts painting, for example. So you know there's at least 2 birds out there. And sometimes you can hear a lot more, and it's often able to distinguish, you know, that there are multiple birds out there. So this is actually a fairly simple citizen science project, and we're looking, community science project, we're looking for people to go out and do this, basically starting now, and take on checking out some of these preserves. If you're interested in doing more than one preserve, let me know as well. The easiest way to let me know you're interested in this is send me an email, and I'm going to have my email address at the end here. But that's actually the best way to let me know that you're interested in, and then I can send you more information on that. So I'm going to stop here for questions. My email address is at the bottom here. If you're interested in the Community Science Project, please feel free to shoot me an email. Or if you have questions about any of the other projects, I know I kind of went through them quickly there on the screen, but there's more information on the volunteering section of our website that you can check out. Couple of upcoming events here that you might be interested in. We're having a week-long bio blitz on 4 of our preserves. Basically, the idea is you go out, you use the iNaturalist app, you make some observations of plants or animals or insects or anything like that that you may see, birds, and use the iNaturalist app to collect that data. If you've never used iNaturalist before, I will be running a program in April to explain about how to use it. It's really easy. You can either put it on your phone and use it, or you can use it on your computer with like a DSLR camera. Either way, use them both. They work the same way, and all your data is collected. And then I can see the data that you collect on our preserves, and we're using that to categorize all of the biodiversity that's on our preserves. So it's really helpful for us as an organization to understand what's out there, because as staff, we can't be out on the ground all the time. And it's really helpful to have volunteers helping us collect that. Doing some warbler identification at the beginning of April, learning about how to identify warblers, a program on spring foraging and learning about things that are growing in the spring, several of which are invasive species that are actually good to cook and eat and use for other purposes. We have a guest speaker doing that. And then in June, Margaret Rohde who works for Wissahickon Trails as well, is doing a presentation on bird banding and about how and why we catch birds. So that'll be really a cool program from her. And there are a number of hikes. I didn't put the exact dates on here because they fill up rather quickly because they're limited due to COVID. But if you check on our website, there's a number of hikes. Some of them are already sold out, but there are a bunch of hikes of varying durations, one that you can bring your dog on should you so desire, and take a look at that. I'm going to go to the questions now. And if you hang on, once I get through these questions, I'm going to turn off the recording and then I will have a special announcement for you. So let me go back up here. Okay. Is the woodcock the one making the slight warble sound after each peent or something else in the background? That's a good question. I think it was actually the bird itself, but I'm not positive about that. We may be able to go back and listen here in a second. Does the female come and join the male at the end of his flight or simply find him on the ground eventually? Usually on the ground. She'll find him in the area that he's painting because he usually stays in that area and he returns back to that same spot that he left from. And she'll come to that area to try to find him. That's why he also does the turn, because that helps her locate him as well. How long does the mating display go on? How many days or weeks do they do this? So it varies. For us, it typically goes on, and it really depends on sort of where you are geographically. So birds that wintered further south than where we are right now may already be singing. And because the males don't care about caring for the young, building the nest, anything like that, they can move and look for mates further along their range, if you will. So they may start down in the south, find some females that are willing to mate there. Those females could already be on eggs in that area. Then they come further north, and some of the females are also migrating, ones that come from an area up here. Usually birds tend to return to the area in which they were born. So if they were born in this area, the females will be migrating north as well. The males may set up a display ground. They may stay at that display ground one night. They may stay there for a week. Kind of depends on the weather, depends on their mood, depends on if they're finding females. And if they're, not really having any luck, they may go someplace else. So that breeding cycle could go on into April and even in the beginning of May, getting up into the range in Canada. So it's actually a while that it can happen, but for us, it's a much shorter time. Really, just March is really the key time that we tend to hear them here. So yeah, that's the key stuff there. Okay, I am going to, don't see any more questions. Oh, I see one. Migrate during the day or during, they actually migrate during the night. Most birds actually migrate at night. And woodcock actually, weirdly, for some reason, they're one of the species that is really susceptible to hitting windows. So oftentimes in places like Philadelphia or New York City, there'll be on nights when there's heavy migration of woodcock, there'll be a lot of birds that people find on the sidewalk in the morning. Some of which are dead from hitting the windows, some of which survive, especially they get taken to rehabs and stuff like that. But yes, they definitely migrate at night, and they are one of the species that is susceptible to window strikes, particularly if the weather's bad, because then they tend to fly lower and they're really confused by those reflections like in a city with lights on and glass windows and things like that. Okay. 1 second here. I want to. All right, I'm pausing my screen share for a second. I need to figure out how to stop recording. All right, I may have to stop sharing. Hold on 1 second.